let's move on to Proposition 28. If we could have Michael come on and do a presentation on Prop 28.
Hi, good evening. Michael Alferez with the Legislative Analyst Office. So I'll just start by providing a quick background on arts education and school finance in California, and then I'll get into discussing the measure. So first, just a quick background on arts education. State law has different requirements for different grade levels to offer instruction in visual and performing arts, but for all grades, the specific courses and amount of instruction provided in these areas is subject to the decision-making of local governing boards. Schools may also provide arts and music instruction through their before and after school and summer programs. Next, just a quick background on school finance. The state is constitutionally required to provide a minimum level of general fund and local property tax revenues each year for public schools and community colleges. In most years, this is equal to about 40% of the state's local general revenue that must be spent to meet this requirement. So with that quick background covered, I'll just get into the measure. So beginning next year, Proposition 28 would require the state to provide additional funding to schools to increase arts education and programming. The amount would be equal to 1% of the funding that K-12 schools received in the prior year, and the funding would be considered a payment above the constitutionally required amount of funding that goes to schools and community colleges currently. So Proposition 28 would distribute the funding through a per student formula and give additional funding for each economically disadvantaged student. Schools must use the funding to increase their arts education programs. The measure has a broad definition of arts, which includes but is not limited to dance, visual arts, music, computer coding, graphic design, script writing, film, and video. Schools with more than 500 students must use 80% of their funding to hire new staff to provide instruction in arts education programs. The California Department of Education may waive this requirement if principals submit a written request showing good cause. The principal of a school site would ultimately determine how to expand their site's arts programs with the funding their schools receives from this measure. Proposition 28 also requires school districts and charter schools to annually report on their website how the funding their school sites received in the prior year were spent, and to certify that the funding was used to increase arts education programs. The measure also allows school districts and charter schools to set aside up to 1% of the funding that their school sites receive for administrative expenses. So for the fiscal effects, we estimate that the Proposition 28 would increase state costs by about $1 billion annually beginning next year for arts education in schools. Over time, the funding for this program would vary based on changes in the required amount of funding for schools and community colleges. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so let's look at who got this on the ballot. Former LA Unified District Superintendent said that he launched it in order to get this, the arts as a core, just along with art, with math, science, and reading. And he actually put a bunch of money towards it too. So the support, the Democratic Party of California, the former U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, there's no official opposition on this one. Support, we have, arts organizations, of course, school organizations, unions, and no organized opposition in terms of groups. And then same thing with spending. We have a lot of spending in favor, well, not a lot compared to the gambling ones, but we have spending in favor of it, including Fender Musical Instruments, the company that makes guitars famously, a bunch of individuals and community groups. And then, we have this lopsided spending on this one, right? We don't have money against it. We only have money in favor of this particular measure. So what questions do we have on Prop 28?
Quite a few so far. So first question is, would this amount be added to the constitutionally required amount of funding?
Yes, that is correct. It would be in addition to the funding that schools already receive.
Great. And then the next question is about the inclusion of programming and coding within the arts. And the question related to that is, could a school potentially decide to spend all of its new funding on programming and coding and none on performing arts?
Yes, that is correct. It would be ultimately up to principals to decide how to plan to, expend the funds that they receive through the measure.
Okay, and then would this statute require community input for planning how to spend as part of the local control funding formula in the local control accountability plan? Or is there a separate planning and reporting mechanism?
So the measure states that, that principals would have discretion to decide how to spend the arts programs, but I don't know if I could speak to how that process might look, because it could vary from school district to school or school to school.
Great. And then a few folks wanting to know where the funding for this would come from.
So the funding for this would come from the general fund. So it would take, $1 billion from the general fund and put that towards K-12 schools, as opposed to, other programs that are funded with general fund.
Okay. And then someone is asking if it would be possible to show the yes/no slide for Prop 28.
Yes, no slide, like this one?
I believe so.
Do we have other questions?
How many schools would receive funding?
So the measure specifies that all schools would receive some funding from this measure. Just depends on how many kids that they have enrolled and how many of those students are from, economically disadvantaged backgrounds.
Okay, and last question, to what extent would this restore previously cut funding from arts programs?
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but school districts with the funding that they get are able to decide how to spend funding. This would just be additional funding that goes to school districts to schools that would be specifically for arts education. So they wouldn't be able to cut their arts education. They would have to increase it with this funding. They wouldn't be able to spend it on other purposes, for example.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.